All right, let's dive right into this incredibly complex history and untangle the massive web of the Lebanese Civil War with this explainer. You know, reading history with true neutrality is tough, but it is absolutely essential. So often we build our worldviews on just bits and pieces of information, and when you're finally confronted with the full picture, well, it can be a pretty huge shock. Today, we're going to take an objective look at exactly how one of the most prosperous, vibrant nations in the Middle East spiraled into a devastating, multi-layered 15-year conflict.
To really understand the fall, we have to look at the peak. In the 1960s, Lebanon enjoyed massive cultural and economic dominance, ushering in a literal golden age. There's actually a famous regional proverb from that time. Cairo writes, Beirut prints, and Baghdad reads. But why did Beirut print? Well, it wasn't just because they had the printing presses. It was a direct result of Lebanon's booming economic strength during that era. They were attracting the brightest minds, the absolute best writers, and seeing unparalleled cultural investments.
But of course, this leads us to the core question of our explainer today. How on earth did a nation known for high-end luxury tourism, financial prowess, and deep cultural sophistication descend into absolute chaos? How did a country famously nicknamed the Switzerland of the East end up tearing itself apart in a 15-year bloodbath? It serves as a really stark reminder of just how fragile prosperity can be when underlying structural issues are completely ignored.
To answer that, we're going to systematically follow this agenda. First, the Switzerland of the East. Second, the sectarian time bomb. Third, the spark of civil war. Fourth, invasions and shifting alliances. Fifth, the Taif Agreement. And finally, some lingering questions.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, the Switzerland of the East, and take a look at that booming economy. On the surface, Lebanon was absolutely thriving. They were essentially taking in global capital as a totally neutral party. Thanks to a strict secret banking system, which is actually where the whole Switzerland comparison comes from, money flowed in regardless of its source. This massive influx of capital transformed Lebanon into the premier hub for financial services in the Middle East, and by extension, a booming destination for luxury tourism. The wealth brought theaters, cinemas, literature, you name it. But underneath all that glitter and economic prosperity, a sectarian time bomb was already quietly ticking away. Which brings us to Section 2, the sectarian time bomb, and the deep roots of this division. You see, both Ottoman and French occupiers intentionally used a classic divide-and-conquer strategy, essentially baking sectarianism right into the nation's DNA over the course of a century. Way back in 1860, following some sectarian strife, the ruling Ottomans divided administrative power between the Druze and the Maronite Christians just to keep the region weak and manageable. Then, when the French Mandate began in 1920, rather than building a unified national identity, the French actually doubled down on this religious division to protect their own interests. They legally enforced sectarianism right into the Constitution. This whole strategy culminated in the famous 1932 formula. Political power became rigidly distributed purely by religion, which permanently institutionalized a fractured state. Based on a French census that counted Christians, Sunnis, Shias, and Druze, the government was hardwired. Because Maronite Christians were the majority at that specific snapshot in time, they held the presidency. Sunnis took the prime minister role and Shias the speaker of parliament. Even parliament seats were strictly apportioned this way. So instead of being citizens of one unified nation, the people became competing factions by design. Then in 1943, a miracle of sorts actually happened. Muslims and Christians united against the French to form an independent Lebanon. This compromise, known as the National Pact, achieved actual independence from France in 1946. Christians agreed not to seek Western or French protection, and Muslims agreed not to try and merge Lebanon into a larger Arab state like Syria or Iraq. It was a massive, historic step forward. But, and this is a huge but, it left that sectarian time bomb completely intact. The underlying structural flaw of a divided government was never fixed. Moving on to Section 3, the spark of civil war, and the breaking point of this fragile system. Following the 1969 Cairo Agreement, armed Palestinian factions essentially created a state within a state, and this severely strained Lebanon's delicate balance. After being expelled from Jordan, the PLO and massive numbers of Palestinian refugees relocated to Lebanon. Just to put these numbers into perspective, you suddenly had around 600,000 refugees in a very small country with no natural resources, alongside roughly 24,000 heavily armed Palestinian fighters. Meanwhile, the official Lebanese army only had about 16,000 troops. These factions began operating their own checkpoints and launching attacks on Israel from Lebanese soil, which drew Israeli retaliation and deeply divided the Lebanese population on how to respond.
The tension finally snapped in April 1975. After an assassination attempt on Christian Phalangist leader Pierre Gemayel, Christian militias retaliated by opening fire on a bus carrying Palestinians in the Ain el-Romani district. This specific incident, famously known as the bus massacre, was the tragic spark that fully detonated the sectarian time bomb. It instantly shattered the fragile peace, and armed militias immediately mobilized across the entire country.
Let's look at Section 4. Invasions and shifting alliances. This is where the chaos and betrayal really ramp up. But before we dissect the actual battles, we really need to pause and reflect on the staggering human cost. 150,000 people dead, over 1 million displaced, and this was over 15 agonizing years. This wasn't just two sides fighting on a battlefield. It was the catastrophic collapse of an entire society.
What's almost hard to wrap your head around is how this conflict became an absurd wheel of proxy warfare. Yesterday's mortal enemies literally became today's allies. Over 13 different factions and 3 foreign nations fought in Lebanon. Just as an example, in 1976, you had Syria effectively aligned with Israel and Christian militias against the PLO and the Muslim Lebanese National Movement. Fast forward a few years, you have Christians allying with the PLO against Syria. Then you have Syria and the Shia Amal movement fighting to decimate the PLO in the War of the Camps. It was a dizzying, completely unpredictable landscape where loyalties could change overnight. And of course, foreign intervention rapidly escalated the violence. Syria and Israel were basically carving up the country to serve their own geopolitical interests, all while heavily arming local factions. Syria rolled in around 1976, initially under the guise of an Arab deterrent force, but that essentially began a decades-long occupation. Then Israel invaded the south in 1978 to push back Palestinian fighters and create a buffer zone. But by 1982, Israel launched a full-scale invasion, driving their military all the way up to the capital.
That year, 1982, brought unimaginable brutality, ultimately culminating in the horrific Sabra and Shatila massacres, which left a permanent, indelible stain on global history. Israel, alongside Christian Phalangist allies led by Bashir Gemayel, besieged West Beirut, eventually forcing the PLO's leadership to evacuate the country completely. Gemayel was quickly elected president but was assassinated just days later. In retaliation for that assassination, Christian militias entered the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, which was surrounded by the Israeli military at the time, and committed a horrific massacre against Palestinian civilians. As if all of that wasn't enough, the chaos built into an even wider proxy war involving Iraq and Iran, leaving Lebanon hopelessly split between 2 totally rival governments in East and West Beirut. As the 80s ground on, new players entered the fray. Iran fostered the creation of Hezbollah, a powerful new Shia militia. In response, Iraq, who was actually fighting its own separate war against Iran at the time, decided to heavily arm Christian forces led by General Michel Aoun in Lebanon. By 1988, the Lebanese government had completely fractured in 2. Now for Section 5, the Taif Agreement. How do you go about ending this kind of bloodshed?
Well, the Taif Agreement mandated some very specific steps to end the fighting, though it clearly left some glaring exceptions that favored foreign powers like Syria and Iran. Negotiated in Saudi Arabia, the agreement totally restructured that old 1932 census model. Instead of Christians holding an outright majority, parliament was now split exactly 50-50. It called for all domestic militias to disarm and hand their weapons over to the national army, with the very notable exception of Hezbollah, which was legally allowed to remain armed as a resistance force. Crucially, it also formalized friendly relations with Syria, which effectively legitimized Syria's continued military presence in the country.
General Michel Aoun, who had rejected the Taif Agreement and the Syrian presence, was eventually ousted by a combined Syrian military effort with implicit international backing. And with that, the war was officially declared over in 1990. But here is the real kicker, the ultimate tragedy of the war's end, the 1991 General Amnesty. It effectively erased the crimes of the militias. It allowed the very men who led the sectarian slaughter to simply put on suits and transition seamlessly into the political leaders of the new, post-war government.
Which leads us to our final section, Section 6, lingering questions and the unresolved paradoxes of this conflict.
We're left with some pretty massive, glaring questions that highlight how, while the gunfire stopped, the deeply entrenched sectarian time bomb was never actually defused. The source material points out the tragic irony of Lebanon's modern history.
Warlords became statesmen without any real accountability. Syria didn't withdraw its military until they were forced out by a massive popular uprising in 2005. Hezbollah retained a weapons cache that far outpowers the actual national army. And perhaps most bafflingly of all, a nation widely known for having one of the most highly educated, culturally sophisticated populations in the entire Middle East remains chained to a medieval system of sectarian quotas.
And this leaves us with one final, haunting question to reflect on today. After such a devastating history of division, foreign manipulation, and profound internal betrayal, can the beautiful Lebanon, the true Switzerland of the East, ever really return? It is a question that history has yet to answer. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it helped unpack this deeply complex and important subject for you.